Welcome to Sunbeam Speedy Roller Shutter Installation Guide. In this guide, we'll take you through a straightforward 7-stage process to get your Speedy Roller Shutter installed quickly and efficiently. This will involve installing the side metal brackets that will hold the roller shutter itself. Then we will install the side guide rails, followed by the shutter motor, and finally the control box that is used by the remote control. Before we begin, let's get the prep work out of the way. First, we will assume that your entryway has been pre-measured and the location of the two side metal brackets have been predetermined. The bracket space should be 600 mm by 600 mm, and the area should contain a small buffer space around it where the bracket will be placed. Also, there needs to be a 100 mm buffer in front of the bracket plate location, enough for the shutter roll to be lifted and nudged onto the bracket. Also, we'll assume that your Speedy Roller Shutter has been delivered to your site. The last assumption is that the walls that will encompass the shutter is level and squared up from side to side and front to back. We should also assume that an electrical outlet has already been installed close to where the motor will be installed. We should inform you that the motor and the electrical outlet could be installed on either side. These are the tools you will need to use under most circumstances. You may need to add or amend to the list depending on your specific application, such as your entryway dimensions, surrounding wall surfaces, or whether or not you had a previous gate removed. In the first stage, we'll install the side metal brackets that will hold the roller shutter. It is imperative that you measure the exact vertical placement where the side metal brackets will go. A laser level is a tool to precisely locate two level points on each side of the walls. Do not use a tape measure to measure from the ground up, as the ground may not be precisely level. Measure from the laser line up to where one of the side metal brackets will be placed, and mark that spot. Use that same measurement to mark the spot on the other side. Next is to make sure that the side metal brackets are horizontally placed and facing each other. You can measure a distance from the front of the front wall, assuming that the front walls are both square to each other. Next is to prepare the surface area where the metal brackets will be placed. It must be vertically level. This is eventually verified by placing the metal bracket onto the surface and using a level to validate. Before you fasten the bracket plate to the surface wall, you need to identify the left side and right side bracket plates. In this example, the bracket plate on the right shows the attachment screws that will be used to attach the motor, and the motor will be attached close to the electrical outlet. This could be reversed depending on where your electrical outlet is. All this will be predetermined before your shutter arrives on site. Once that is determined, you need to fasten the bracket plate to the wall surface using either welding or fastening bolts. If you are using fastening bolts, make sure you use at least 4 bolts and fasten them to the farthest corner holes of the metal bracket plate. Placing the bracket plates accurately is a very crucial step, and you must measure for vertical accuracy again. In the second stage, we will hoist the roller shutter up to the side metal bracket plates and attach them. You'll need a machine like a forklift, determined by the size and weight of the roller shutter. The roller shutter must be placed with the right orientation. This means that the side with the large gear wheel at the end must be placed where the motor will be. Once the shutter is level with the flat plane of the bracket attachment device, nudge the shutter onto the protruding extension plate on the bracket. Once you have the shutter in place, there are 2 angles at which you can attach the end of the shutter to the bracket plate using a screw. This angle depends on the access by the socket wrench, either from the top or from the side, determined by the walls surrounding the bracket plate. The same procedure needs to be done on the other end. In stage 3, we will be installing the side guide rails. It's important to make sure the vertical placement of the guide rails from the side and from the front. Other than a level, you can use a laser level, or you can use a plumb, which will ensure verticality trueness from all sides. If the wall is not determined to be vertically level, you will need to compensate the wall with concrete, silicone, or fastening bolts, depending on the location, situation, and size of the entryway. Guide rails may be a bit longer than needed. You need to measure the distance from the ground level to the bottom of the bracket plate. Once you have that length, you must add 3 centimeters to that length to allow for the distance the guide rail extends above the bracket to fasten the guide rail to the bracket. Now perform the same task on the other side, and note that both guide rail lengths may be quite different. Next, use that measurement from the previous step to cut the guide rail. Measure from the top end down and make a mark as to where to cut the guide rail. Before cutting, remove the black tabs from the bottom and put them aside for later. Pull the brushings up into the guide rail. Proceed to cut the guide rail. Pull out the brush lining from within the guide rail and fold them back into the guide rail and hammer the black tabs into place as shown. This will anchor the brush lining at the bottom to prevent the lining from being pulled up as the roller shutter rolls up and down the guide rails. Now perform the same tasks for the other guide rail. Next, place the guide rail into position, which is where it will be attached to the metal bracket plate, which is the location of the second and fourth holes on the bracket plate as shown. Next, use a level to make sure the guide rail is vertically straight along the wall. Next, use a temporary marker or chalk to mark off the placement of the guide rail along the wall as shown. Perform the same procedure on the other side. Next, drill pairs of holes on both lines approximately level with each other. These pairs should be vertically spaced at approximately 1 meter. Use fastening bolts and hammer them into the holes. Then weld the guide rail onto the fastening bolts. In stage 4, we will attach the motor. The motor may be attached on the right side or the left side. This will be predetermined before your shutter arrives because the shutter motor must be located near the power outlet. The motor is attached to 3 bolts. 2 bolts will be facing outside in and 1 will be facing inside out. Remove the 2 nuts from the outside in bolts and remove the 1 inside out bolt. Before you place the motor into position, you must place the release gear cable into its gutter at the bottom of the motor. Then you have to pull it taut so it won't fall out of the gutter while you place the motor. That being said, place the motor into position, making sure that the teeth in the motor meshes with the teeth of the gear wheel. Replace the 2 nuts and the single bolt. Make sure that the release gear cable is not inhibited. Also note that there might be a single gear wheel already attached to the bracket plate. Sometimes this idle gear is attached because of larger size shutter doors. When rolled up, the thickness of the roll would otherwise reach the motor. In stage 5, we will be connecting the wires and cables from the motor to the control box. The first cable is for the gear release or neutral clutch release, which we mentioned in stage 4. It extends from the bottom of the motor. You can turn the control box over to send this cable through the top of the control box and attach to a lever using a bolt and nut as shown. You may need to cut the wire before attaching it, but you must leave enough room for the control box to sit about 1,200 millimeters from the ground. The next cable to connect is from the motor to the circuit board, which resides within the control box. This black cable will have 2 white connectors and will extend down from the motor. You can thread the cable through the back of the box to the front. You can then detach the cover from the control box by simply snapping it off. Attach the connectors as shown and reattach the cover. Attach the control box onto the wall about 1,200 millimeters from the ground. In stage 6, we will do some adjustments. First, we will tighten up the axle spring located at the opposite end to the motor. Use the spring tension tool to reach into the space between the side metal bracket and the axle roll. Insert the tool into the receiver on the axle and turn it away from you. Then ratchet the tool back and forth until the spring feels tight. Next, you must release the gear by pulling up on the cord on the top of the control box, which will allow you to manually partially pull the shutter down through the guide rails. Reset the motor release gear under the control box. At this point, you can test the gear release with the remote control. Press the single button at the lower part of the front panel. The black reset handle at the bottom of the control box will drop down, indicating that you can manually pull up or down on the door. Remember to reset the black reset handle. Next, we must set the highest and lowest position of the shutter using what we call limit switches. First, set the switches so that they are splayed apart from each other as shown. Next, use your remote control and move the shutter to its most desired lowest position, which is typically just barely touching the ground. Then flip the upper switch down. Next, use your remote control and move the shutter to its most desired open position, then flip the lower switch up. You can make micro adjustments. Toggle the lower switch up and then down. Then use your remote control and press the up button. This will nudge your shutter up. You can do the same thing for the lower switch. Now you can test the limits of the remote control. Before setting this function for safety reasons, you should try it at mid-levels first to avoid oversetting, resulting in overroll or slamming the bottom of the slat into the ground. Also note that if your motor is on the left side, then the limit switch functions have opposite meanings. The top switch controls the top limit and the bottom switch controls the bottom limit. In stage 7, we will attach the overroll detachment line. First, apply double-sided tape to the detachment line guide. Then apply the detachment line guide to the guide rail that is on the same side as the motor. As you move up the detachment line guide to the very top, there are 2 wires that extend from the guide. Use these 2 wires and connect them to the 2 wires originating from the motor that are attached together with a connector cap. Next, attach the line extending from the bottom slat to the detachment line that is on the detachment line guide. There is another overroll mechanism on the upper region of the door. It is a press lever that also prevents the shutter from overrolling into the shutter housing. This mechanism has 2 lines that needs to be connected into the motor housing. Remove the top cover, revealing the motor circuit board. Attach the 2 wires to the connectors as shown and replace the cover. At this point, you can test the bottom slat touch sensor by closing the shutter and applying pressure at the bottom. If you have ordered extra remote controllers, you will have to set them up as follows. First, you need to reach underneath the control box opening at the bottom and press the button as shown. You'll hear beeps which indicates the box is in learning mode. Then take your remote controllers and one by one press the upper right button on each. A beep audible will sound off every time you press one of the controller buttons. Finally, reach back into the control box and press the same button as before to finish the operation. There is a second method for installing the Speedy roller shutter, and that is to have the entire structure, including frame, roller shutter, and motor, pre-built and delivered to your customer's location. After arriving, you will need to lift the entire structure into place and attach the side brackets to the wall along with the guide rails. This completes our installation guide for the Speedy roller shutter. We hope it was helpful. If you have further questions, please contact Sunbeam using the contact information on our website.